everybody. It is Dean Z speaking to you from Jeffries Hall, room 1225. Very nice classroom, but I don't have anything interesting to say about it because this building was not built for decades after I graduated. So who even cares, really? Anyway, I am here today. I want to talk to you about the waitlist. Now, I did an episode on the waitlist in season 1. It feels really pretentious to call it a season, but whatever. Episode 30. But it was from a very different point of view. I did that one in February, and it was really about who gets on the wait list, are those decisions made, and that sort of thing. This episode, I want to talk about how do you get off a wait list if you are on one. Specifically, how do you get admitted? I mean, you can always just withdraw from the wait list. You're off it that way. But I mean, how do you get in if there's a school that you are really, really hoping to go to? At the outset, I'll say, I just got back from the annual law school admissions conference, and that's a great time for catching up on what's happening at a lot of other schools. And I can tell you a lot of schools are expecting a lot of waitlist action this year. The season started out, by waitlist season I mean as soon as everyone's deposit deadline has passed. That's really when the waitlist season starts. So our waitlist season started out with a couple of big schools that are peer institutions that we are always battling with for students going to the waitlist in a big way. And so even after the deadline, I thought I had the class that I needed with a bit of a cushion, which I'll talk about in a minute, but I was right where I wanted to be. And then I lost 20 people or so, almost 20 people pretty quickly to these two schools' combined efforts. So then we started going to the wait list too. And so we go to the wait list, and then the schools from which we admit people, they go to the wait list, and so on and so forth. So if a school, at the very top of the food chain, if you will, goes to the wait list, there's a trickle-down effect. So I'm expecting a lot of action off the wait list this summer, which is unusual in recent history. The last couple years have been pretty quiet on the wait list front. So that's my first point I want to address. Often people on, I'm just going to say Reddit, I'm sure there are other forums, but I think Reddit is the main one. People on Reddit will say, school X never goes to the wait list, or they admitted 5 people last year, so don't get your hopes up. And so I think people hear that and think, oh, I'm doomed, there's no way I'm ever going to get in. But the history of these things goes back at most 1 or 2 years. And first of all, it may not be totally accurate, but even if it is, it's just a very small snapshot. So I've been doing this a quarter century, and I can tell you that some years we haven't admitted anybody from the wait list, and some years I've admitted up to maybe, what amounts to 20% of the class coming from the wait list. That's not usual, but it does happen. So there can be huge variety from year to year, and last year is really not a predictor of the next year. So if someone's trying to make you feel very depressed about your chances, take that with a grain of salt, because the past is not a predictor. In any event, as I say, this seems to be a pretty volatile season, which is what I would expect. That's not really surprising to me. As I think I said in an episode last season, the Supreme Court's decision in Students for Fair Admissions meant that all law schools, well, not all, Michigan didn't have to change anything, Berkeley didn't have to change anything, UCLA didn't have to change anything, but almost all law schools had to change their admissions processes to a certain degree because race is no longer allowed to be a factor. So basically, schools that have years and years of yield models and know if they admit a certain number of people, a certain number of people will enroll, all of that's sort of up in the air because everybody is doing something different. And that has played out. So a lot of schools were surprised. They admitted however many people they intended to admit, and their classes perhaps are smaller. I'm sure there's some schools where their classes were bigger, surprisingly, but in any event, a lot of volatility out there. I mentioned a few minutes ago that we had a cushion right after our deadline, and I want to talk about that for a minute, just so to help you understand, how this process works. We're aiming for a class of 300 to 320 people. I expect to, no matter what happens, regardless of waitlist, I expect to lose a certain number of people. People will want to defer because an opportunity came their way. People will want to defer because perhaps a medical problem, perhaps a problem in their family. People will decide they actually don't want to go to law school at all, after all. So I expect to lose, at least 10 people to that sort of movement. And so you always need a bit of a cushion. So if I want 320 people in my class, I want at least 330 deposits. And in addition to that, there's of course the number of people who you may or may not lose to a wait list. All of that is called summer melt, which I remember when I learned that term way back when I first started this job, and I was like, that's kind of cute, summer melt. You may not think it's cute, but now you know that that's what we call it. So if a school, you want to maintain that cushion, for a fair degree into the summers. Now, of course, if you have a cushion of, say, 20 people and it's early August and you're about to start classes in mid-August, then maybe you have a little bit of a problem. You have a class that's a little over-enrolled. But again, you're going to expect to lose people. So even if a school is not under-enrolled, they may still want to go to the wait list in order to maintain that cushion. The number of people that a school wants to admit, that of course is outside of your control. So you need to be a little bit zen and realistic about this. And even if a school is admitting people, some of that is outside of your control too, in the sense that schools may be admitting not just to fill their class, but maybe they have target medians and a target LSAT median or a target GPA median that they didn't hit that median, or they hit it but they're almost in danger of losing it. And then they'll want to emphasize that when they're admitting people. So maybe you have a really high LSAT, but the school that you most love is worried about its average GPA. That could be a problem for you. Schools may have other kinds of goals too. So at Michigan, we have a goal of 20% of our class coming from the state of Michigan. It's not usually a problem, but I can imagine a year where I have only 18%, for example, and then I'd want to make sure that anyone I'm admitting is from the state of Michigan in order to fill out that soft quota that we have. But putting all that stuff to the side that is outside your control, what can you do? What is in your control? Well, I think there's two categories of things. One is showing a school you're interested, and the other is rectifying any possible mistakes. Let's start with the mistakes issue. There are two areas of the application that I see weaknesses in that frequently get otherwise strong-seeming candidates on the wait list, because I am hoping that maybe they will reach out and fill me in. Those areas are one, the resume, and two, misconduct explanations. On the resume, people often just don't tell me much about what they've done. Maybe they've only told me about their jobs, but haven't told me about any extracurriculars they were involved in school, or if they're working currently. Maybe they tell me their job, but they don't explain what the job is, and so I'm sort of at a loss. Maybe there are lots of gaps in the resume that just aren't explained. So go back and look at your resume and think, would someone who doesn't know me, who's not familiar with my history, understand what was happening here? And to the extent you can fill in the holes, do that. Send a follow-up email. Just say, upon reflection, I realize that maybe I didn't explain my job progress adequately, so here's some additional information. And then in terms of misconduct, that's one that often trips people up that shouldn't, right? That there's nothing actually sketchy going on, but they've just given such bare bones details that I am at a loss to understand, and it worries me. So I saw one recently where someone talked about, I think the word they used was altercation, that they'd been involved in an altercation. And there was really not much more than that. And look, does the word altercation mean that they, beat the tar out of someone? Or does the word altercation mean that they had a shouting match with someone? In either case, what provoked it? Was it, and even if the person who's applying to law school was the provocateur, which isn't ideal. But even in that case, you could really help yourself by taking responsibility for it, by really explaining the details and explaining how, what your mindset was and how it may have changed since the incident. So I'd take a close look at that too. And then just in general, I'd look at your application and just see, is there anything you could strengthen perhaps? Maybe you didn't write any optional essays in a school invited you to. You might want to do that now. But just make sure that there's nothing no stone left unturned in your application. So that's number one. Number two, and this is the most important one because it applies to everybody, show you're interested. When I am considering people for admission, to be very frank, we have a lot of strong candidates that we could choose among. There is nothing more awkward than having a conversation with someone where I say, hi, we're going to our wait list and you're on it and I'm wondering if you're still interested, and they're like, sorta, and then they're not forthcoming, and it's just so awkward, and I want to just be like, prank call, bye. It's just awkward. So in advance of that, people who have reached out and indicated their interest, whether that means sending a formal letter of continuing interest or just an email or just having stayed in touch frequently, that can be so useful. Now that takes a lot of work on your part. So I would think very carefully about what are the schools that I am most interested in. And, I wouldn't try to do it if you're on 10 wait lists. I wouldn't try to do it for 10 wait lists. I would balance what schools seem to be going to their wait lists, and you can get that information sometimes directly from the school, sometimes from Reddit, with what schools are you most interested in, and I would focus on those schools. And when you're thinking about how can I express my interest, I would, first of all, pay very close attention to anything the school has told you about how to communicate with them. They'll give you instructions, they'll give you some guidance. Don't assume that guidance for one school applies to another school. Make sure you have read everything you can from that school about what they're looking for. And if they are silent on the question of how to show your continued interest, think about giving them a call and just seeing if you can elicit any information that way from whomever answers the phone, or if you can get connected to an admissions counselor. And if all else fails, I would just go ahead and send them an email saying how much you value them and would love to be there, and be as specific as you can about why. If you have connections to the area, if you've got family in the area, if you've got friends who are in the class, if you've got a significant other who's going to be in the class, all of that is good stuff to specify. Now, there will also be some schools that will require you to make a sort of a pre-commitment to them. I talked about that in the episode I did earlier, and I just want to revisit that because that is still something that's happening 3 years later. I don't love it because it means that you're telling a school in advance, if you admit me, I will attend, and then they often give you as little as 24 hours to turn around and make your deposit. And you don't know anything about financial aid. And that just strikes me as unfair and imbalance of power. And I personally would think carefully about, whether that works for you. On the other hand, if it is your dream school, I guess, what do you care? If you really feel like, yes, I'd go without any financial aid, I don't care, I know immediately that I want to go there for whatever reason, then sure, go ahead and do that, and make sure you've dotted all your I's on whatever process they have, because schools that have that kind of process, they really, I don't think, will call you, from what I can tell, if you haven't done that. So make sure you have. And now this is sort of a very nuts and boltsy sort of piece of advice, but make sure you know the area code of the school that is your dream school or schools, so that when they call you, you answer, or at a minimum, you call them back right away as quickly as humanly possible. And make sure you're checking your email frequently in case they want to communicate that way. I mean, when we are going to the wait list, we're moving pretty fast. So if we reach out to someone and we don't hear back in 24 hours, that's kind of, there you go, we're done. Now we may go back later, but we fill our need at the moment, and it may not come back again as a choice, so as an opportunity. So make sure you are, really on the ball that way. Finally, if a school asks you about financial aid, I would say, you should think about that. If you possibly can, think about that in advance. How much financial aid do you need in order to feel like you're making a good decision? That is, your desire to be at that school is balanced by how much it's going to cost you. And, be honest about that if they ask, but be realistic. So don't ask for the moon if you really want to go to a certain school. Don't tell them, and you'd go honestly for full freight. Don't tell them you'd only go if they give you a full ride, because the chances are they're not going to do that. Some schools will give you the same financial aid that you would have if you had been admitted earlier in the season. Some schools will give you a little more depending on that school's resources, but some schools, are working with much less money towards the end of the season. So you need to be thinking about that, you probably have a pretty good intuitive sense of which schools are going to have more resources and which schools are going to have fewer, and you could really scare a school off by saying, I need XYZ amount that is shooting for the stars. Now, if that's what you want, if that's what's honest, then you should do that. But just balance that and think carefully about what you really need. All right, I think that is all of my advice about how to get off a wait list. Good luck with this. I know it's a really stressful process, and I am full of admiration and sympathy for the people who are willing to participate in it. Okay, so we've got one more thing left to do, and that is the sort of grammar, like the sort of legal related something or other. That's how I'm thinking of it. Legal related something or other for the end of each episode. And this one is courtesy of Dustin. And to be very honest, I have to tell you, this is a pet peeve of Dustin that is a pet peeve I've committed. And I do have to wonder, has he been for years and years thinking, why is she saying that? And so full of rage, and he finally figured out a way to pass it on and educate me. I don't know, he's too nice. He's not really going to tell me. But here it is. It's the words theory and hypothesis. And when he said it, I immediately clicked what he meant, but I definitely made this mistake. So a hypothesis is your idea about a certain situation. So I have a hypothesis that Dustin has been holding back a lot of rage at me because I have misused this word. Theory is actually the word I misused, not hypothesis. Theory means you've tested something, you've explored it, and you come up with a theory to explain a bunch of data and information. So the theory of relativity is a theory that is based not on Einstein's small supposition. It was based on a lot of thought and data gathering. So it's, it maybe is not fully proven, but it is a very solid theory. God, I can't even think of a synonym for that, but you get my point. So, now I'm going to be very self-conscious about the word theory for the rest of my life, and I hope to share that burden with you. Okay, and that's all I got. Thanks as always to Dustin, not just for being an amazing videographer and podcast wizard or whatever, but for educating me. Thanks, man. And of course, as always, please leave comments below or questions. And if you have an idea for an episode or a question you want us to answer, feel free to email us at law.jd.admissions@umich.edu and put vlog in the subject line. All right, wherever you go, go blue.